Good morning to you all. I hope you guys are having a good Tuesday. Let's get everything set up here. How you guys doing? Hope everybody's had a good weekend. Hope you guys are avoiding the news as much as possible. There's so much going on. It feels like you just can't ever catch up with everything going on in the world right now. It's crazy. So, let me get my everything all started. Okay, here we go. So, today we're going to be doing the War of 1812. Next time, I believe we will be doing the Era of Good Feelings. I think that's correct. And then, in fact, let me just pull up the calendar so we can figure that out and see where we're at. Okay, so here's the calendar. Oh man, I was totally off. Okay, so I forgot that I had moved some lectures around. Okay, so we are here, War of 1812 on today, October 6th. Next time we'll be doing the Market Revolution and then the Awakening and Reform next Tuesday. Next Thursday, we have a discussion over markets and social movements, and then Era of Good Feelings after that. Some professors do it a little bit differently. Some professors do the Era of Good Feelings and Jackson, and then kind of do the Market Revolution and Awakening and Reform. The reason, just to kind of give you an insight into the reasons why I do the things that I do, these two lectures right here, the Market Revolution and Awakening and Reform, are lengthy lectures in the sense of timeline. They go from roughly the year 1800 to the year 1850, and as a result, I like to do them early, so that way you kind of have those things in the back of your mind as we move forward in the class, rather than doing them at the end or even in the middle. So we're going to do those in the next coming days. Your next discussion is here next Thursday. I believe I graded everybody's discussion for you guys. I'm still working through the tests. They just take me a while. Like I think I told y'all in an announcement in last week that I've had a lot of stuff going on kind of in my own life, and so it's just grading has been kind of like unfortunately pushed to the side a little bit. But this week I have finally cleared away some of that stuff, and hopefully we'll have time to finish up all that grading that I have stacked up for myself. So that's where we are in the class. Next test is October 29th. Near the end of this month, just in time for Halloween, or just before it, I suppose. So today we're going to be looking at the War of 1812. This is one of those wars that most people have no idea what happened in this war, which is totally fine, which means that it's exciting and we can learn something new today. And the War of 1812 is one of those wars that I think is more important than a lot of people realize. It is, not only is it a war that a lot of people don't know much about, but it's one of those wars that really helped establish the United States as a legitimate power in the world. If not obviously not to the extent that we are today, but it at least legitimized the United States in the eyes of European countries. So let's kind of set the context here before we get into the war itself. So the context of the War of 1812, is you got to look at Europe first. So in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars are happening. So the French Revolution is over. Napoleon has taken over. And Napoleon had attacked numerous countries. France and Britain were involved in the fight against Napoleon. They had also been taking steps to kind of hurt Napoleon's economic enterprise, I suppose. So let me phrase that a little bit more effectively. When Napoleon took over France after the French Revolution, he created this small French empire here. It's not really small. He created this French empire here, taking over large parts of Europe. England, of course, is its own island. Napoleon could not take over England. So England and France are at war under Napoleon. And both France and England don't want each other to trade with the United States. So any merchant that went towards England might get taken over by the French. Any merchant that went towards France might get taken over by the English. And so there was a lot of problems on the high seas. In the West, which I don't have a map of, but in the West, Americans are, we talked about this last time, Americans are expanding west into that frontier area, both north and in the south. And what that's going to do is put pressure on Native American tribes. Native American tribes are going to ally with the British and the Spanish in an effort to kind of stem the tide of Americans coming into their land. And so what's ultimately happening in this war, the War of 1812, is that there is conflict in the western frontier with the Native Americans. There's conflict on the high seas with the Europeans. And both of those conflicts, even though they are very different, come together in this war. And so the War of 1812 is kind of a war that's fought all over the place. So, again, let's keep talking about the conflict in Europe and how that affects what's going on in the United States. So Napoleon had taken over much of continental Europe. Britain had destroyed a large part of the French Navy at a battle called the Battle of Trafalgar. And you can see that. Let me get the new map up here. You can see these early trade routes between the United States and Europe and Africa and the Caribbean. We talked about this being the triangle trade early on in the semester. So Britain is trying to prevent goods from getting to France. All right, Britain, and obviously the United States is a key trading partner, not only to England, but also to Europe in general. And here's the thing. The United States at this point in time, 1812, had one of the best merchant fleets in the world. You got to remember that, Boston, New York, many of the smaller cities up on that New England coastline, they made their money by shipping. That was how they made their money. The Puritans, right, going all the way back to the colonial era, the Puritans made their money through the shipping trade. And so the United States had this great merchant marine fleet. And the U.S. really controlled all the trade right here in this key channel between the United States and the West Indies. And so as a result, the United States was in a important position economically during the early 1800s. But now there's a problem, because with Britain and France kind of at each other's throats, America's kind of being forced to choose sides, because Britain doesn't want America trading with France. France obviously doesn't want America trading with Britain, although there's little they can do about it. And for the Americans, if they trade with one side and not the other, that makes them look like they've chosen a side, right? And America's really trying to remain neutral in all of this. They don't want to be involved in the war, in a war in Europe, right? There is very little desire amongst the American public or the American politicians to be involved in any sort of war that's going on in Europe. But the problem is that their ships are getting captured, right? The American ships are getting captured by both the French and the English. And so you have this situation where, the Americans are trying to trade with both sides. They're trying to remain neutral, and yet their sailors are being captured and impressed into service by both the French and the English during this time period. And so both the French and the English are doing this, but most Americans are going to blame the British. The British have a larger navy, and often they were seen as like the worst offender of all of this. The French Navy was smaller, and they didn't get as much blame for the impressment. British ships frequently would capture an American ship, impress the sailors, force them into service. You know the drill. And here's the problem with impressment, is that the British Navy was not a fun place to work. The British sailors, like people from England, called the British Navy a floating hell. Like, that is the literal quote from a British sailor from this era. He said that working for the British Navy was like working in a floating hell, because sailors were treated terribly. If you didn't work correctly, or if you, if you stepped out of line, you could be flogged, meaning like whipped, for punishment. Sailors were paid very little. The conditions aboard the ships were terrible, and so this is an awful place to work. And in fact, many of the British sailors themselves were forced to work for the British Navy. What the military would do is they would basically go to like bars and like pick up all the drunks and the criminals and then force them into service into the British Navy. So the British Navy is like not a good place to be. So the British are kind of impressing their own citizens into service in the British Navy, and now Americans are being impressed into service into the British Navy. Many of the British who didn't want to be in the British Navy would desert if they ever got the opportunity. Like, let's say a British ship docks in Boston, right? Or docks in Virginia for trade purposes. The sailors would go ashore, obviously, to probably to drink and to eat food and to rest. Some of them would just never come back to the ship. They would just desert, right? These British sailors would just be like, we're out of here. And so America actually had a pretty substantial population of British troops that had once been part of the British Navy, which is kind of odd. And that actually becomes a problem because Britain knows this is happening. And because they know this is happening, many of those British sailors who at one point in time had worked for the British Navy, they deserted and lived in America. And then because their skill was sailing, that's what they did for a living, they would join up with the American merchant ships, and basically get a job as a trader, right? As someone who would trade on the ships and work as a sailor. But that's the problem. Britain knows this is happening. Britain knows that its sailors are deserting, moving to the States, and then working in the American merchant marine in the trading fleets of the United States. And so that was the justification that the British used to stop all of the American ships. They would say, well, you guys have our citizens, our sailors aboard your ships who technically abandoned their post, right? They abandoned the military, and so we're going to take them back. And so that was how the British justified impressment, was by saying that they were just reclaiming their own citizens. The problem is sometimes they would also impress American citizens too, right? They didn't just board a ship and take the British, the British citizens that had fled. They would also kidnap Americans. This comes to a head in 1807 with an incident called the Chesapeake Incident. There's an American ship called the Chesapeake, named after the bay. It's stopped by a British ship. The British believed that there were British deserters among the crew. However, the commander of the Chesapeake refused to allow the British on board. He was like, no, you have no right to board my ship. So the British opened fire, and wounded the boat. The American commander of the Chesapeake was forced to surrender, and the British boarded the ship and basically dragged 4 men off of it, and then went back to England. Jefferson, who was president at the time when the Chesapeake incident happened, really wanted to maintain peace. He sent James Monroe to London to try to kind of smooth things over, to basically encourage the British, like, hey, stop impressing our sailors, man. Like, this is not, like, you can't just do this. But Britain was steadfast. They were like, no, these are our people. Like, we have a right to reclaim our people. And if that means taking over your ships, then so be it. And in fact, Jefferson's Embargo Act in 1807 was partially the result of this incident. It was partially the result of Britain refusing to not impress American sailors. So, because Jefferson worried that future impressment might lead to war. He didn't want to fight a war with England. Remember, America's still a young country at this point. I mean, they're only on their 3rd president. They've only been around for about 20 years. Going toe-to-toe with Britain again didn't sound great to a lot of those, politicians, particularly if you were involved in in trade, right? You didn't want to go to war with the person that you traded with. That would be economically disastrous. So Congress tried to get Jefferson passed his Embargo Act. It didn't work very well. The Congress tried to get around that act by passing a new act that would allow traders to trade with the rest of Europe, but not with Britain and France. But that doesn't work very well because Napoleon has taken over all of Europe, right? So, like, what does it matter if you can't trade with France if Napoleon controls everything and he's the French, right? So, ultimately, what's happening here is these problems on the high sea are going to drag America slowly into a war with Europe. Because you have these, you can even go back a little further if you want to the presidency of John Adams and the XYZ affair of 1796, and how the French basically asked for that bribe and demanded an apology, and so there's this series of problems that keep happening on the ocean, and there's this mistrust and resentment that like kind of builds up on both sides. And so that's how America is going to get into a war with Europe, is that there's this mistrust and resentment from years and years of problems on the ocean, really stemming from trade and the kidnapping of sailors. That's how America is going to get involved in the war in Europe, because of conflicts on the high seas. Let's shift to the west now. Okay, so that's the ocean, right? That's going on in the ocean to the east. Let's shift to the west and talk about how America is going to get involved in a war with Europe, with Native Americans at the same time. So, right from the start of American history, white settlers had been ruthlessly dislodging Native Americans from their land, either through wars of extermination. For example, the Pequots were basically exterminated in the 1620s by the Puritans, or Native Americans were removed, right? So it was either a war that was fought to exterminate Native American groups, or a war that was fought to convince them to move elsewhere. Either way, Native American groups are getting pushed westward. And this is a problem, as we've talked about, because if you're a Native American group, you're being pushed, you're kind of trapped between two enemy groups. You probably have enemies to your west, and you're being trapped by the Americans themselves. So, here's the thing. Native Americans were excellent traders in their own right. They had their own goods that they would trade to Europeans and to Americans, and those goods could be worth quite a bit of money. But with Americans constantly pushing into their territory and starting wars, the Native Americans weren't too keen on trading stuff to them. And so instead, Native Americans started trading with the British, particularly up here in British Canada. Right? So if you're looking at this map right here, this area right here of British Canada, there's still a lot of Native Americans that live there. There's still a lot of Native Americans that live up in this area too. And they would trade with the British up in Canada. And this was very lucrative, particularly the fur trade was incredibly lucrative still. And so at the turn of the century, roughly around the year 1800, Americans are starting to push into this Northwest territory right here. You can see that Ohio is made a state in 1803, and these other states follow a decade or two or three later. But so Americans are gradually pushing from these original 13 states westward into this Northwest territory, and also that's happening in the South, down in Kentucky and in Tennessee. The guy who is, and let me show you a map of the Native Americans in this Northwest territory, you can see how dense and diverse the Native American groups are in this area. These are very, very famous groups, right? You've got the Ojibwa up here who are up in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Canada. These are the Iroquois over here with the Mohawks and the Mohicans and the Oneida and all these other groups. So there's so many groups who are, here's the Pequot right here. These are one of the first groups to kind of get removed in American history. But so these are the people who are being pushed out, right? And so one of the guys he's not responsible for this, but he is as Americans push west into this Northwest Territory here, you got to have somebody who's in charge of these territories, right? Ohio becomes a state. They have a government. People start pushing into Indiana next because it's right to the west. And the process goes, as more people move in, you eventually gain enough population to be able to apply for statehood, right? That's that whole Northwest Ordinances that we talked about a while back. But while you're waiting to become a state, you got to have some sort of government, otherwise it's just going to be chaos in this new territory. And so this guy, William Henry Harrison, was made the governor of Indiana Territory. William Henry Harrison was already a veteran. He had already fought in numerous Native American wars, and he was an advocate for expansion into those Northwest Territories, right? So he wanted Americans to move into them. He even served as a delegate during the debate over the Northwest Territories, right? So this guy had his fingerprints all over Americans moving into these territories. In fact, you don't need to know this law, but he had a law named after him called the Harrison Land Law that allowed white settlers to acquire farms easier, which made him very popular because, people could move into places like Ohio and Indiana much more easily and get land. But the problem is that land came at the expense of Native American land, right? So William Henry Harrison is basically converting Native American land into the land for white settlers. And so he is very unpopular with Native American groups, very popular with Americans. Thomas Jefferson wanted to solve the Indian problem. And so he kind of gave Native Americans a choice. And that choice was either convert to farmers, right? Live kind of a more American lifestyle, assimilate into white society, give up your tribal allegiances and kind of settle down on individual family farms, or you move west. Those are your options, right? As in either case, Native Americans would be forfeiting the land that they controlled in that Northwest Territory. And remember, there's a lot of it. All right, so this is the Northwest Territory. If you're kind of like, the map is a little bit different than the other one, but this is the Northwest Territory right here that I'm outlining with my mouse. All these groups, at the Miami, the Shawnee, the Kickapoo, all right, the Miami, if I didn't already say them, right, the Erie. These groups would all be forced to give up their land and move west, or, as Jefferson told them, they could kind of convert to white farmers, essentially, right? They would assimilate into American society and turn into farmers. Jefferson thought that was better than going to war with them. Jefferson was much more in favor of assimilation rather than destruction of Native American societies. So Jefferson is the guy who appoints William Henry Harrison to be the governor of Indiana Territory. Harrison, because he's so in favor of removal, it's an odd appointment for Jefferson to make, because Harrison often uses cruel and underhanded tactics to harm Native American groups. He would use threats, he would bribe people, he would trick Native American groups into thinking one thing and then he would do another. And the thing is, between the years 1800 and 1810, 500,000 Americans roughly had moved into that Northwest Territory. So you got this flood of white people moving into Native American land and basically claiming it as their own. So Native Americans are increasingly under pressure from the movement of white settlers. And what's happening essentially is that the U.S. is either taking the land either by force or by treaty, right? It's either like, we are going to force you guys out by using the military, or we're going to make you guys sign treaties to give up your land voluntarily. But either way, you're going to give up your land, right? That was the threat the Native Americans were facing. This is happening in that Northwest Territory right here, in that Ohio country, and even really over here in Michigan and Indiana. But the same thing is also happening in the South as well. This is actually happening all across and the reason why I have two circles here is that these are the original 13 states over here, right? And so as people push west, they're pushing into this Northwest Territory right here, but they're also pushing west into this territory down here, right? Both of these circles represent kind of like the western frontier to the Americans, but both of them are, of course, controlled by Native American groups, right? So the same thing that's happening up here in this northwestern territory with Governor William Henry Harrison is also happening down here. And so groups like the Shawnee and the Cherokee and the Creek are also going to come under pressure from American settlers moving into their territory. Native Americans wanted to resist, right? They wanted to resist the pressure coming from white society. The problem is that as separate tribes, they were largely helpless. Many of these groups did not have political alliances in the way that Americans thought about them. Oftentimes, up to this point in American history, many of these tribes had fought and lost by themselves. Pequot probably being one of the better examples. However, Powhatan did have that confederation, right, of tribes that fought together. But at this point, the American military could easily crush a single tribe, right? It wouldn't even be a fight. So what starts to happen is that Native Americans have two choices. Native Americans can either relocate, right? That's one choice that Native Americans had. So let's talk a moment about agency and the idea of being able to do something, right? So if you ever hear somebody use the term agency, not in the sense of like a bureau or something or like a place, but more so saying like I have agency. What that means is that I have choices to make. I can do things. I have the ability to make decisions. So remember, the Americans are saying, hey, you can either relocate or we're going to kill you. Those are the two things that can happen. And so for the Native Americans, they were left with two choices. They could either relocate, right? They could give in and move west and give up their land, or they could fight back, right? They could resist. And that would mean fighting against the American military. Those are essentially the choices that they had. And these Native American groups, because the settlers are pushing them westward, these Native American groups are kind of being pushed closer and closer and closer together. So in the early 1800s, a guy named Tecumseh emerges as the main leader of the resistance in those Northwest Territories. Many of these tribes are going to choose to resist rather than giving in. So this is the early 1800s. Tecumseh is a Shawnee chief, right? So if you flip back to this one, the Shawnee are right here in this kind of Ohio and Indiana territory as well. So there's Tecumseh. This is one of this picture might not be Tecumseh. It's one of those like artist representations, and we don't actually have a real image of Tecumseh, unfortunately, because he never sat for a portrait. No one really knows exactly what he looks like. But either way, he emerges as the main resistance leader in that Northwest Territory. And Tecumseh led an interesting life up to this point. He actually grew up in the American Revolution. Like, he lived during that era, where people are talking about revolutionary ideals. People there's this feeling of patriotism, this feeling of revolutionary ideologies. At the same time, there's also still Native American relocation and violence. And so both of those things affect the way Tecumseh views the world. Because while the American revolutionaries were talking about freedom, freedom from tyranny, they're also killing Native Americans. And Tecumseh and the Native Americans, it's the white Americans that are the tyrants, right? It's the Americans that are tyrannical towards the Native Americans. So it makes sense why he would be like, hey, we need to stand up for ourselves. Tecumseh was very eloquent. He was a good leader. He was well read. That's he knew what the revolution of the American revolutionaries were talking about, were writing about. Tecumseh was kind of a military and diplomatic leader. So he is the guy who's going to lead the troops and be the man you'd see in the front lines. And Tecumseh makes a very important argument for the Native Americans who are under him. He argues that Native Americans need to stand together in order to fight back, right? Even though he's the leader of the Shawnee, he argues, hey, we need to ally together, like all of us need to come together to fight against the Americans, right? We can't do it alone. And he has this like certain militance about him, this militant ideology that this is the only path forward, right? That this is the only path, is to band together and to fight back. And he realized that earlier Native American groups lost because they didn't have allies, right? He realized that earlier Native American groups died out because they couldn't withstand the pressure from the Americans. And so I love this quote from him that's on your screen here. He said, "Where today are the Pequot? Where are the other people, the other powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white man." If you don't know what avarice means, it's a good word. It means greed, to be greedy for something. And so basically he's saying, hey, where are the Pequot? Where are all those other powerful tribes? They're dead because they vanished. They didn't have allies. We need to band together. That's a powerful message, right? Because all the Native Americans know their history, right? They know that those other tribes have been defeated, and they knew what happened to them. And so essentially what Tecumseh is arguing for here is a pan-Indian alliance. Pan-Indian meaning like all Native Americans, right? But like bring all the Native American groups together in this pan-Indian alliance. So that way we don't disappear like the Pequot did. Without land, there is no survival, is essentially what he's saying. We have to resist. So Tecumseh's urging people to resist, and he's like the guy that's going to bring people together. He's that military diplomatic leader that people are going to gravitate to. But he has a brother, this guy, whose name is Tenskwatawa. If you don't want to say that, that's fine. He is also called the Prophet. Many people just refer to him as the Prophet, including back in that time period. That was kind of his nickname. And the reason why is because he is the spiritual leader of the resistance. So while Tecumseh was over here being like the military, guy banding people together, Tenskwatawa is leading kind of a religious revolution amongst Native Americans. He's also part of the resistance that Tecumseh is building, but he's doing it from a religious standpoint rather than a diplomatic or military standpoint. He was charismatic, just like Tecumseh, a great orator, good with public speaking. And he, at one point, was suffering from alcoholism. And this is, like many religious leaders in human history, he had this great mystical awakening. So in the process of recovering from his alcoholism, he had this, vision, this mystical vision. And he said that, what he said was that he freed himself from the evils of white culture, and in this case, I think he meant alcohol. And so Tenskwatawa's vision was essentially like, hey, I got sucked in by the evils of white culture, and I had to kind of liberate myself. And so he urges other Native Americans to stop picking up the negative influences of white society, to instead go back to the ways of our ancestors, right? To go back to Native American ways, to return to the roots of Native American society. Tenskwatawa argued that borrowing from white culture, would basically lead to the death of Native American society, because it would cease to be Native American society and would instead become something else. We actually see this idea in other places too, like with the Comanche in Texas. There were different groups of Comanche Indians, some of which had more, not friendly relations with white settlers, but they were closer and thus adopted more. There was more like kind of cultural exchange, and those Comanche were seen as kind of like lesser than by other Comanche. It was a really interesting dynamic. But so Tenskwatawa here is saying, basically, don't be seduced by white society, right? That'll lead to the death of Native American culture. Instead, we need to return to our roots. And so in a way, it's almost like this like separatist movement. Like we got to separate ourselves from the culture and society of white Americans. And so this is going to lead to this kind of like religious revival in the region where Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa live. It's going to be, Tecumseh's providing kind of like the history lesson. He's like, hey, like these other tribes have died off. We got to band together. And Tenskwatawa is kind of providing the religious reasoning for why we need to band together. It's to save our culture. And so both Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh are needed, are necessary for bringing the tribes together, right? For uniting all these Native American groups into one kind of big Indian alliance. So Tenskwatawa founded this town that became known as Prophetstown. That was kind of like the headquarters of the resistance, so to speak, the resistance against the invasion of white people. It was at the convergence of these two rivers. You can see the Tippecanoe River right here, and then the other one is the Wabash River right here. And this area, this Prophetstown, kind of became a sacred place for many of these tribes. People would kind of come there, pay homage to the prophet, and kind of get involved in what they viewed as their own revolution, right? That's essentially kind of what Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa were arguing for, is their own version of an American revolution, except this time it would be one driven by Native American purposes. So, as a result of Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh's leadership, it inspires this call for greater cooperation, and tribes start considering these military alliances. And so in 1809, Tecumseh goes down the Wabash River and down into the south. He's going down into the Mississippi Valley, taking the Mississippi River, and he's trying to unite the tribes down there with his up north. And if you remember this image right here, the Mississippi's over here, so they're like right here in Indiana territory, and he's taking this Mississippi down to try to convince all these groups kind of in this region right here, like, hey, let's ally together, right? If we form a solid front in that western area, we will be able to defeat the Americans. So he's trying to create like a big, like almost like a Native American firewall, like a boundary that Americans can't push into. And he also believed, Tecumseh is basically telling these other tribes, he's like, look, I know you guys control this land, but land is just land, right? Native Americans didn't have a sense of private property the way Americans did. And so he's like, look, land is just for everyone. If we all band together, then it's just Native American land. It's not any one particular tribe's land. So Prophetstown becomes the kind of headquarters of the resistance. And note that it's right here in Indiana and that the British are really close. I'm going to zoom back out here again. So Prophetstown's like right here. And to get to the British, all you got to do is go right up here. Right? The British are very, very close to the Native Americans at this point. And of course, there's all these Native American groups in Michigan and other places. And so what starts happening is Britain sees an opportunity. Britain wants to weaken the United States. Remember, there's all the problems going on the high seas at this point, right? Britain is impressing American sailors. Britain sees an opportunity here to weaken the United States. What they start doing is they start providing help to the Native Americans. Britain here is like, hey, you guys are trying to fight the Americans? Cool, we'll give you guns. We'll give you ammunition. So what starts happening is these Native Americans start kind of working together, right? They start forming these alliances. They're loose, but they do exist. And the British are like encouraging it, right? They're saying, yeah, we want you guys to ally together. Yeah, we want you to fight the Americans, right? Here's some guns. Here's some bullets. Take it to the Americans. But when Tecumseh goes down south to try to recruit other tribes, it leaves the Native Americans in that Indiana territory in a weakened state. And at that moment, William Henry Harrison and the Americans decide to attack the Shawnee and their kind of allies in a battle called the Battle of Tippecanoe Creek. Harrison took advantage of the fact that Tecumseh wasn't there, which means that they had lost their main military leader. And so he launches an attack into Prophetstown itself. They actually, the Native American forces meet them outside of Prophetstown near that Tippecanoe River. And both sides lose a tremendous amount of people. It's in terms of losses, both sides lose about the same amount. But the problem is, and this is going to be a problem going forward, is that Native Americans cannot sustain the losses that the Americans can. The American military can throw thousands and thousands of people against Native Americans. But Native American numbers are steadily dwindling, right? They're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so if you have a battle where the Americans and the Native Americans lose the same amount of forces, that's really a loss for the Native Americans because they just don't have as many people. So the Native Americans are forced to retreat at from the Battle of Tippecanoe. The American soldiers move in, burn Prophetstown to the ground, which was, think about what that would do to the mindset of the followers of the prophet, right? This guy is telling you that we're going to band together and we need to resist, white culture, and then white culture just moves in and burns your town to the ground. It was a disillusioning moment for the followers of Tenskwatawa. Tecumseh returned eventually, and when he returns, like, he sees, everything is just in disarray. And so by the time you get to the year 1812, which is actually the year that we're talking about in this lecture, the War of 1812, is that Tecumseh and his allies, what are left of them, are raiding white settlements, right? That's how they're fighting this war. Is they will surprise attack white settlements in the frontier. The British are supporting them with arms. And so for Americans in this region, in this Northwest Territory, they become angry at the British for supplying the Native Americans with guns and ammo. So in an interesting way, you have Americans angry at the British for a number of different reasons, right? You've got people angry about the impressment on the high seas, and then and that's going to anger people like businessmen, merchants in that New England area, people who work in the shipping trade, versus in the West, you have Americans angry with the British for helping the Native Americans. So there's a lot of inflamed anger towards the British at this point. Now, the last place we have to talk about is Florida. We have to talk about Florida and war fever. Because while the Northwest Territory, the people who are living in this Northwest Territory are angry with the British, and they're like, hey, we want to kick the British out of here. Let's just take over Canada. It was kind of what they were saying. Southerners, on the other hand, wanted to conquer Florida. Florida's right down here. Florida, of course, is owned by Spain at this point. And remember, we talked about this back when we talked about the Stono Rebellion, that Spain controlled Florida and that escaped slaves were escaping down into Florida and gaining their freedom and then moving off elsewhere. Not to mention that there are a lot of Native American groups that live down here, particularly along this border right here, and they would invade into Georgia and then move back across the border into Florida, and the American military couldn't follow them. Not to mention that Florida is, of course, just its location is excellent for controlling the Caribbean, and Americans wanted to control, that the ports and the rivers and obviously this whole coastline that exists around Florida as well. So there were a lot of reasons why the Americans wanted to take over Florida. So this is all, we're in the year 1810. So again, we're kind of moving, we're not quite at the War of 1812 here. I'm kind of building us up to that point. There are white settlers in western Florida, which is this region right here. This kind of disputed territory right here that's kind of like this dark reddish color. And they had seized a Spanish fort in Baton Rouge right here in Louisiana. They wanted the president to annex this territory. Madison, who is president at this point, says, okay, we can start moving in on this western Florida area right here. And Spain, this is an important point here, is that Spain was Britain's ally. Oh boy, right? So you've got literally war fever happening everywhere in the United States around the year 1812. You've got people down here agitating for a takeover of Florida, that Spain owns that. Spain is Britain's ally. You've got the Northwest Territories up here who want the British kicked out of their territory, and hell, like, let's just take over Canada while we're at it. Of course, that would mean a war with the British. And then here on the East Coast, you've got people who are angry about impressment being done by the British. And so all over the country, people are angry about Britain for various reasons. And so into this moment comes this group called the Warhawks. The Warhawks were a group of young politicians. They were congressmen mostly, and they supported aggression, right? That's what the term Warhawk means. In American politics, you can kind of divide foreign policy beliefs into two categories. One is a hawk, who is someone who promotes a more militaristic type of foreign policy, a person who's more willing to go to war. On the other side, you have doves. Dove, of course, being a symbol of peace. A person who is a dove supports diplomatic foreign policy rather than warfare. Well, in this case, you have this group of young politicians who want to make names for themselves. And the easiest way to do that to them is like, hey, let's go to war. This is a new generation of politicians, right? These guys like Henry Clay, John Calhoun are not from the founding fathers, right? These guys were born after the creation of the United States, so they didn't fight the British in the American Revolution. They grew up when America was already its own country. That's important because it means that they're like incredibly patriotic, almost like nationalistic in their beliefs, and so they don't understand why people like Jefferson are allowing American sailors to be kidnapped. They're like, this is outrageous. We should go to war immediately. What are we waiting for? They basically argued that the U.S. is being pushed around, and we shouldn't be pushed around, right? That's what people like Henry Clay and Calhoun are arguing. You've got all these problems, and the British are behind all of them. Let's go to war. Like, what are we waiting on? Most of these Warhawks are going to come from western states and southern states, right? Like Henry Clay comes from Kentucky. That's a western state. John C. Calhoun comes from South Carolina. That's a southern state. They roughly come into power around the year 1810. And what's amazing about the Warhawks is that people like Henry Clay and John Calhoun, we will talk about them for the next 40 years in this class. From 1810 through the 1850s, they are important. They're everywhere. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun are both so important for various stages of American history. And this is where they get their start as like young agitators looking for a war with England. Both Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun are men of great intellect and ambition, magnetism. Both eventually they will kind of go in separate directions politically to some degree. But they both are incredibly important for the purposes of this class. Henry Clay, I think in particular, had the most amazing life in a way. He's such a fascinating character. When he was elected to Congress, this is so crazy. When he was elected to Congress, he got the Speaker of the House is the leader of the House of Representatives. It's the person who is in charge of the House of Representatives, and they're the head of the party that has the majority in the House. When Henry Clay was elected, he was made Speaker of the House on the very first day he stepped into office. The Speaker for the House right now in our current era is Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is not to be mean, but she's old in the sense that she's been around for a long, long, long time. Most of the time, that's how it goes, is the person who's the Speaker for the House is usually someone who's been around for a while. And Henry Clay rolls in. He's young. I think he's like 26 or something, like maybe 30. And like day one, boom, Speaker for the House, right? It just tells you kind of what kind of a magnetic personality he had. Roughly in terms of age, someone asked in the chat, I'm not 100% sure how old these guys are, but I think they're roughly around 30 years old at this point, which is incredibly young for politicians in the United States. You got to remember that in order to be elected to Congress, you at least have to be 25. In order to be elected president, you at least have to be 35, right? So there are age barriers preventing young people from gaining election. So these guys are pretty young for being politicians. So yeah, for sure, right? So young. Like, I'm 36, right? And like these dudes are like already in Congress and like making their it's one reason why people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the congresswomen from New York, she's a Democrat. She's like 28 or something, like maybe 30, right? Like very, very young. And it's remarkable. Like, that's very rare in American politics for people that young to be elected. But so here's the thing. These war hawks are like pushing for war. President Madison, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute, didn't want to go to war. He preferred peace, but he was losing control of Congress because you got these guys coming in like Clay and Calhoun who are dynamic and like, no, we need to go to war. They made war seem good. They made war seem patriotic and that it was good for the Republic. And so in 1812, finally, James Madison declares war with Great Britain. And so finally we get to the War of 1812 after all of that. The thing is, Great Britain is not eager for a war with the United States, right? Great Britain is locked into a war with Napoleon. But in the year 1812, Napoleon makes a disastrous choice to invade Russia. And if you're familiar with that story, it does not go well for Napoleon. He goes in there with an army of, hundreds of thousands strong and leaves with like 90,000 troops. It was just a disaster. So after Napoleon's retreat from Russia, Napoleon is basically on his way to losing, which gives Great Britain the chance to kind of turn its attention to the United States. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the War of 1812 in two different areas. We're going to talk about it in the Northwest, in those Northwest territories with Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, and then we're going to talk about what's going on in the Southwest, in like the Mississippi Valley area. So up in the Northwest, remember the Native Americans up there, Tecumseh and his groups, are being supported by the British. And here we see the Native American wars are kind of conflicting or intertwining with British interests. Not conflicting, but intertwining, right? You've got the British who are supporting the Native Americans. There's lots of fighting around that Great Lakes region. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about all this because I already spent so much time detailing how this kind of fight occurred. But the ultimate battle that happened, the kind of climactic battle of the Northwest Wars, was the Battle of Thames. And that is how you pronounce that word. I know it doesn't look like that, but that's the British phrasing for a British word. It's not Thames, it's Thames. Basically, this is in October 1813, just north of Lake Erie. It's a pivotal battle for the war in the Northwest. William Henry Harrison had pushed up the Thames River into Canada. Like, the Americans actually invade into Canada a couple of different times in this war. They fought against the British and Tecumseh, right? So literally Americans are fighting against not only the Native Americans, but also British troops. So you have Tecumseh and his people have formally allied with the British. Tecumseh, though, is killed in this battle. This is an artist's depiction of the slaying of Tecumseh. This is Tecumseh right here. This is clearly not how people dressed back then. Like, no one's going to war looking like this dude. And Tecumseh is dressed very differently than how he's depicted in other images. And so I think this artist might have just, I don't know why he depicted him this way. But I'm assuming these guys over here are also Native Americans. I don't think Native Americans wore clothes like that. So I don't think this is a very accurate representation of the battle. But Tecumseh's death here is a serious blow to Native Americans, because this is the guy who was urging, hey, let's band together, right? This is that energetic guy who's saying, like, let's all band together. It's the only way we're going to survive this. He was that inspirational leader that brought all these groups together, and now he's gone. And no one can fill his shoes. Not his, like, I think his brother had either been killed earlier or would be killed soon after. No one could fill the shoes of Tecumseh. And so it was difficult for his people, the Shawnee, and the others who had allied with them, to kind of carry on without him. And this war, the War of 1812, is a pivotal war for the region, that Northwest Territories region, because from this point, the American military will control that territory. And as we've talked about with other Native American groups, there's always a pivotal moment where the Native Americans just can't keep up the resistance any longer, right? With the Powhatans, it was that Powhatan War in the 1600s. You had the war up in with Metacom up in the New England area that ended the resistance up there. Same thing happens here in 1812. The War of 1812, the Native Americans in that Northwest Territory just lose their ability to resist the pressure of white Americans. They're gonna start getting pushed further and further west, and there's just not much they can do about it because they've lost people right in this war. They've lost lives, and you can't fight back if you don't have anybody to fight with. But the other thing is that they've lost their charismatic leader, and people in some ways, just are eventually going to start moving. In the Southwest, things are a little bit different. In the Southwest, so I want to take a quick second to note here the phrases that we use in American history. So to the vast majority of Americans, when you say, "Oh, I live in the Southwest," no one thinks of Mississippi, right? To us, Mississippi is like the Deep South. But back then, remember, most Americans lived on that East Coast, and so the Southwest was actually Mississippi and Tennessee. What we would consider the Southwest as like kind of Western Texas, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. That was like Indian country, right? That was like so far removed from what most Americans were thinking of. That wasn't even anything on their radar. For them, the Southwest was this region that I've got highlighted right here, this like Tennessee, Mississippi territory. So there was a group that lived right here in this Mississippi, Alabama area, what is modern day Alabama, Mississippi, called the Creeks. And they had been under attack for years by settlers moving into their territory. And very similarly to what was happening in the Northwest, the Spanish down here in Florida had been supplying the Creeks with weaponry, with ammunition. Very similar. So the Americans view these situations as kind of the same. And remember, the Spanish are allied with the British. And so to the Americans, all they see is a foreign enemy is supplying Native American tribes with guns. And so thus, not only are the Native Americans the enemy, but the Spanish are also the enemy. This is where we're going to see a new leader come to the fore for the Americans. I unfortunately don't have a picture of him on here, but we will talk about him soon enough, and his name is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson makes a name for himself in these wars. You can think of Andrew Jackson as also a war hawk. He's kind of part of that young cohort of military leaders, politicians who make a name for themselves during this war. So Andrew Jackson is sent down to Mississippi. He is a wealthy planter from Tennessee. He owns slaves. We'll talk a little bit more about his biography in a future lecture. But Jackson has a long history of hating Native Americans, and he viewed the War of 1812 as an opportunity. Sorry, I had to see what my dog... Look at what my dog is doing. Look at this guy. Look how stretched out he is. Look at that guy over there. He's like... He's a snake, man. I don't know what he's doing. But so, anyway, Andrew Jackson is a little bit older than the other Warhawks. He actually was alive during the American Revolution. There's a famous story of when... I don't know how true this story is, but it's one of those stories that got told often enough it probably became true. And I think part of it is true. That during the American Revolution, I believe Jackson lived in New York City, and a British troop, like a British soldier, Jackson was like 7 years old, and a British soldier like demanded that he shine his boots, and Jackson refused, being a little patriot. And the soldier like hit him with his sword, not with like the actual like blade part of the sword, but with like the scabbard, and Jackson had a scar right here on his forehead for the rest of his life from that incident. So anyway, Jackson hates the British. He also really hates the Native Americans. He gets sent down to Mississippi Territory as a military leader to basically remove the Native Americans, right? He viewed this as his opportunity to remove the Native Americans once and for all. And so in March of 1814, we're in Mississippi Territory. Jackson and his troops are moving in to this territory, and he's trying to crush the Native Americans in this area. It's a group called the Red Sticks. They were a part of the Creek tribe. So the Creek is kind of like a large umbrella term, and the Red Sticks were a group underneath them, or within that umbrella. Jackson had an overwhelming advantage of troops. He had about 3,000 troops to the Red Sticks, roughly 1,000. And he ordered his troops to charge into this fort, which in this battle will become known as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, I believe, for the bend in the river. The Red Sticks refused to surrender. They suffered more than 800 casualties, losing 4/5 of their people in this war. And to modern historians, this is less of a battle and more of a slaughter, more of a massacre, because Jackson and his troops didn't just kill warriors, they also killed women and children. There were stories of mutilated corpses. And so from our modern lens, like, this was not just a war against a enemy group. This was a war of extermination, right? It's not just removal, but literally like exterminating this group of people. At the time, this was the worst loss the Native Americans had suffered at the hands of the American military in their history. There will, of course, be future losses that will be worse. But what's ultimately happening here is just like what was happening up in the Northwest Territory, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and some of these other battles that are happening. The War of 1812 is this disastrous moment where in this southwest region right here, especially with the Creek, there's going to be a decline in resistance because there's just not enough Creek left to resist the power of the Americans. The Creeks agreed to eventually cede their land, to give up their land to the Americans, and eventually the Creek, along with a lot of the other groups in this region, will be forced to move west. Doesn't happen immediately, but it will happen eventually. So while this war is happening, there are this 1808 is when James Madison is elected. James Madison had been Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. He was also from Virginia. So in the first 5 presidents, there's this interesting correlation. John Adams is the only odd man out. John Adams was from Massachusetts, whereas George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe were all from Virginia. I believe all were slave owners. And aside from George Washington, every single one of them served as a Secretary of State for somebody. Jefferson served as Washington's Secretary of State, Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. So Madison is already a well-known name, right? He's not a nobody. You may remember me talking about Madison when we talked about the Constitution, because he's basically the brain behind the Constitution. He's the guy who wrote large parts of it. He also wrote many of the Federalist Papers that defended the Constitution. So he's a great thinker, right? An intellectual giant in the United States. Not the best politician, though. He is a Democratic Republican. Not the best politician, but fortunately for him, the Federalist Party is pretty weak at this point in time. And you can see, Madison wins in 1808 pretty comfortably, 70% of the vote. And then 4 years later, as the war is kind of about to, is heating up, he wins again. This time, a little bit lower of a total. This fusion party that you see right here is basically a grouping of the Federalists and other kind of splinter groups up here in this New England region. So this war becomes known as Mr. Madison's War because even though the Americans are having success against the Native Americans out in the West, they're not doing well against the British. In 1814, Britain actually invades America itself, fought numerous battles in the eastern, kind of on the eastern seaboard, On August 1814, or in August of 1814, England took over Washington, D.C., literally took over the capital of the United States, burned the White House to the ground. This is a picture or a drawing showing the burning of the White House, the original White House in 1814. Normally, when a country loses its capital and their capital is burned to the ground and another country is able to take it over, that's usually the end of a war. It's like, hey, we control your capital now. Give up. The U.S. military efforts against the British in this war were largely a failure. There are a few notable exceptions, some of them being against the Native Americans in the West. But by and large, the American military did not have a good fight in this war. They tried to invade Canada. They lost. They lost forts in Detroit. They lost forts in Chicago. They struggled to keep Britain away from... I mean, they burned the White House down, man. Like, think about that. It's crazy. And so what starts happening is that people start... They link Madison to this war. Madison becomes unpopular over time because the war is not going well. And when a war is not going well and you're losing on your home turf, people are looking for a place to blame, right? And so Madison becomes the guy people start blaming. They're like, we're not winning because, we shouldn't have even been in this war maybe, or, it's going to breed this contempt for Madison. And especially in New England, this war is unpopular. It was never that popular in New England to begin with because New England is the shipping hub of the United States. Many of those people had ties to Great Britain very directly. So they had like a solid economic relationship with the British. And so the war in some ways was like ruining their livelihood. They hated the embargoes. Like they basically just hated this whole mess. And so what happens is New England kind of starts to revolt a little bit. There is this meeting called the Hartford Convention. It happens in December of 1814 when the war is looking really grim, really bad, right? The White House has been burned down a few months prior. And the opposition becomes so extreme in New England that many people in New England actually start hoping that the British win. They're like, good, if the British win, we can be done with all this nonsense and go back to the way things were, right? We can just keep trading with the British. Madison's Democratic Republicans are struggling to control Congress, right? The Federalists control the New England area. And so in December of 1814, the Federalists hold this big meeting called the Hartford Convention. It's not just one meeting, but it's a series of meetings from December 1814 into January of 1815. And they're meeting in Hartford, Connecticut. That's why it's called the Hartford Convention. Hartford is a city in Connecticut. And the reason why the Federalists are getting together is because they're trying to discuss problems. They want to discuss their grievances that they have with James Madison. There were some radical people at this convention. There were even people who were like, hey, New England just needs to secede from the Union, right? But like, this is a moment where you have people who are advocating for New England just to be like, hey, we're going to be our own country. Like, you guys can do whatever you want down in the South. However, that doesn't happen. The moderates outnumbered the radicals here. But what they did do is they proposed these new amendments to the Constitution to protect New England. They worried about the growing influence of the South and the West because there was a lot of land in the West and the South. And New England realized that soon enough, the West and the South will be able to outvote the people in New England. And so there's this fear of what that might mean for the people who live up there. And so delegates are even starting to think of the idea of nullification up here, and thinking about how can New England protect itself from the people who are in the South, the people who are in the West. This looks, bad. For the Federalists, this is a rebellion in a way against the way things have been against the country in a way. But they viewed it as important because Madison was losing this war, they thought. So while those guys are meeting up in Hartford, a key battle takes place in New Orleans, but something weird is going to happen here. So Jackson goes from Horseshoe Bend down to the Gulf of Mexico and then over into New Orleans. And he begins to set up shop in December of 1814. But something crazy happens. So on December 24th, Christmas Eve of 1814, there is a treaty that is signed called the Treaty of Ghent. That's Ghent, Ghent, Ghent. Ghent is a city in Belgium. It's where the delegates met. And basically the Treaty of Ghent declares the War of 1812 to be over. So no more fighting between the Americans and the British. So essentially, we're done. But this is the old days. News travels slowly in this time period, right? It's not like today where you can just look online and see a tweet and see some crazy nonsense has happened. Back in this time period, if a treaty gets signed, it might take weeks for it to get, think about it. The treaty would have to go from England across the ocean to America and then down to Jackson and his troops to tell them, hey, you don't need to fight anymore. So Jackson doesn't know. And so even though the treaty has been signed, Jackson and his troops fight and win a battle in New Orleans. This is a famous battle, and it's a battle that makes Jackson a hero because Jackson had fewer troops than the British. He only had 4,000 troops. The British had roughly 6,000. Yet the U.S. wins this battle, kills thousands of British troops, and the Americans only lose 70. It's one of the most lopsided American victories in this war, and it came at when the war was actually already over. The battle had no impact on the peace treaty being signed because the peace treaty had already been signed, right? But it's important for perception purposes because what happens is many people read the news about Jackson's victory because it happened, in the United States. They read the news about Jackson's victory and then read the news about the peace treaty. And so many people kind of conflated the two and thought to themselves, Jackson won this war and he beat the British so badly that the British surrendered. Obviously, that's not the way it happened, and not everybody thought that. But some people did, and so there was this sense that Jackson had defeated the Creeks, and he defeated the British, right? Jackson is going to, when the War of 1812 is over, Jackson is one of the most famous Americans at the end of this war. Jackson becomes a household name and instantly gains credibility, and that he's going to use that credibility to become a politician. So let's talk about the significance of the war itself. I'm going to talk about what the Treaty of Ghent actually did. The Treaty of Ghent is a weird treaty because it doesn't actually do that much. It is signed on Christmas Eve of 1814, and all it really did was end the war. That's really it. It just ended the war. It didn't declare a victor. There was no territory exchanged. Nobody gave either side money. It just ended the war. And what the Treaty of Ghent decided, is this phrase down here, is what the Treaty of Ghent did. Status quo ante bellum. Now, many of you have probably heard the phrase status quo. Status quo simply means the way things are. Right? So if you're a politician and you say, I want to maintain the status quo, you're saying, I'm going to keep things the way they are. Antebellum means before, right? If you ever played poker and you got to make an ante, right? Ante means before the hand. You're placing a bet before the hand. Bellum means warfare or war. And so this is what the Treaty of Ghent did, is it returned to the status quo before the war. So basically it's hey, let's just act like this war didn't happen. Go back to the way things were when the war was, before the war happened. That's all the Treaty of Ghent did. Nobody won or lost. There was no land exchange, no money exchanged. Basically it was just let's just act like this thing never happened. Go back to the way things were before the war even started. So, let's do one last thing and talk about the overall significance of the war. Despite the treaty kind of being skimpy and not really doing anything, the War of 1812 is actually quite important. Some historians or scholars call the War of 1812 the Second American Revolution. And if you think about it, that kind of makes some sense. because it's America or the United States versus Great Britain. The Americans don't win in this case, but they do gain respect. America again fought the British this time to a draw. And after the war, Britain recognizes American sovereignty, which was something they didn't do after the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, I think Britain always viewed the colonies as kind of like, an escaped colony that they could go back and recapture at some point. But after the War of 1812, Britain acknowledged American sovereignty and was like, yep, you guys are your own nation now. And over the next few decades, in fact, Britain would become an ally of the United States. Over time, Britain is the most important American ally. And so ironically, in a way, the War of 1812 kind of starts this process. Out of this war grows a key alliance for the United States. Another key piece of significance about the War of 1812 is the emergence of new heroes, new leadership. You've got those war hawks, people like Calhoun and Henry Clay, who are going to be political leaders for generations, or at least for the next 40 to 50 years. You've got the emergence of Andrew Jackson. So these guys are going to be critical names that you will hear over and over and over again for the next few lectures. For the Native Americans, on the other hand, this war was an absolute disaster. Tecumseh was dead. The Pan-Indian Confederation that he built had collapsed. The British had really stopped trading, or at least like they were gone from the Northwest Territories. The British had been pushed out of those Northwest Territories, so they couldn't trade with the Native Americans anymore. The Native Americans lost the battles in that Northwest Territory. The Creek had been massacred in the Southwest Territories. And as Americans pushed westward, the Native Americans, because of these losses, were less and less able to defend their land. And so this political cartoon, I think, does a great job of summarizing the War of 1812 from the Native American perspective. You've got the American and the British soldier right here telling each other that they lost, right? The Treaty of Ghent didn't declare a loser, but they're trying to claim it, right? Saying, you actually lost. And the reality is that it was the Native Americans who lost, right? That it was the Native Americans lost this war, even though they weren't written into these treaties, right? They were the true losers here, because Americans are going to keep pushing west. They're going to keep fighting the Native Americans, and this is just yet another episode in American history where, Native Americans resist, try to fight for their land, but ultimately lose and are going to just keep getting pushed further west. So, I'm going to stop there. That is the end of this lecture. Remember that next time we will be doing the market revolution. So that'll be on Thursday. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Otherwise, I'm going to cut it off here in just a moment. So I'll wait for some questions, see if you guys have any. He's no longer all stretched out on the ground. He's back there on his pillow. Yeah, thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it. Just waiting to see if there's any questions. Of course, I'll be posting this lecture. I need to catch up on posting the lectures into the discussions. Was a war ending that way unprecedented? I'm not really sure. I'm not really a military historian, so I don't really know much about how wars have ended over human history. But you'd think it's kind of odd. It's certainly odd that both sides just decided to be like, let's just stop fighting. And I don't know why they came to that decision. Why there was this decision to stop fighting, because the Spanish were there too. And Spain didn't give up Florida in this war. That would actually come later in 1819. There will be a treaty that's signed where America will essentially kind of buy, to a certain degree, Spain from Florida. So I don't know. I don't know why they ended the war this way, but it certainly is odd. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. I really appreciate y'all. I hope you guys have a wonderful Tuesday. I'll see you guys on Thursday.